Okay, well, welcome everybody. This is the second time through a class we're doing here at the Rogue Valley Metaphysical Library, a crash course on critical thinking. The overarching theme, how do we navigate our post-truth world? We talked about that at our presentation the other night, and I'll talk about it a little bit more in just a second. When everybody got an outline. Each class will be putting out a single-page outline. I guess you could call it a syllabus that has an outline of what we're going to talk about. There's some key books that we're going to be using, some key points on the side. Each week we'll update this, and a definition of critical thinking that we'll look at in just a second. During the break, we'll print out, for those of you that weren't here Tuesday night, we'll print out this other sheet that gives you an overview of all of the classes. And maybe just really quick for the benefit of those of you that weren't here, there are 4 classes. This is the first one, where, and I'll tell you what we're going to do tonight in just a second. But we've got 3 more classes on the next following 3 Thursday nights. And like I said, we'll give you the sheet that gives you the whole outline of what we're going to do, so you can get an idea of kind of where we're going with that. But for now, we always tell people, when you come to our talks, we often explore things that are new, and we like to get into a lot of the cutting-edge science that's out there. We ask people to kind of set your controls for discovery. Marla loves to talk about being an anthropologist from Mars, to take, kind of have this kind of scout mindset. We're exploring topics. And in particular, we're going to be using the tools of science in our exploration. Cognitive psychology, evolutionary psychology, moral psychology, neurobiology, and psychometrics. And as we go through the course, if you're not familiar with those disciplines, you will become familiar with those disciplines. You'll know what they are, because we're going to be using them quite a bit in our talks.
So one of the things that we like to front load is that, like Rob mentioned, sometimes we mention ideas that might rub against people's cherished beliefs. So that you might be leaving your comfort zone, maybe not, but maybe. And a comfort zone, leaving your comfort zone is a really good place, because that's where we grow. It's where we're being exposed to new material. So, but it can make us feel, maybe you've heard the term cognitive dissonance. When something rubs up against an idea that you really believe in, and it can, like for me, my experience is I feel really wobbly, I get confused, a little foggy. And if that happens, just breathe and just realize that, there's not a bear chasing you right now. We're going to get more into that, how our nervous systems react to that kind of thing. Also, what we like to mention is that a lot of times when we're listening to a point of view that's different than ours, or I'll make it an I statement, I'll go into rebuttal mode, like I'll be talking to Linda and saying, yes, but in my head, just waiting for you to stop. But we really ask you to bracket that out, to really listen to what's being said, and form your opinion later. And also, I'm sure this won't happen here, but we have had situations where people hear something they don't like and then they leave. And they also sometimes have questions that they don't stay for the answers for, so that they leave unresolved about certain things. So just stay all the way through. And also what we ask, because our presentation is really laid out, and although we would love to have an open conversation during it, when we've done that in the past, we've not finished the material. So what we're going to do is Rob will speak first for about a half hour, 35 minutes, then we'll have a 10-minute break and have some refreshments, and then I'll finish up, and then we'll have the last 20 minutes for Q&A or comments or discussion. So there's pads of paper here too if you want to make notes to yourself. And also we'll be doing a couple little journaling kind of exercises. So thanks, Jordan. It's good to have on hand. Oh, and one last thing. Please no side conversations. It's disruptive to your neighbors and also to us. And you can always talk to your friends at the break and afterwards. Okay.
So this is a crash course on critical thinking. And, well, what do we mean by critical thinking? Well, this is how we would define it. Objective analysis and evaluation designed to form good judgment. That's what we mean by critical thinking, objective analysis and evaluation designed to form good judgment. It involves conscious, deliberate questioning, adopting a skeptical mindset, questioning not only the assumptions of others, but also our own assumptions, maybe particularly our own assumptions as we become critical thinkers. And at the root of this word critical, I used to teach New Testament Greek, and the Greek word that's based on has the idea of discernment. It's the idea to cut between what's true and what's false. And it's a process that involves observation, very slow, careful observation and deliberation. And we'll open up some of that tonight, to explain a little bit more about what we're talking about. And big question, we talked about this Tuesday night at our presentation, a big problem we have today, how do we know what's true? When I was growing up, I just hit 60. When I was growing up, everybody pretty much was on the same page, basically. We had very similar kinds of values. There wasn't a lot of viewpoint diversity because there weren't a lot of viewpoints out there that we knew about. Well, that's changed remarkably. And it's largely because we live now in what people call a post-truth world. And again, this is what we talked about on Tuesday, a post-truth world. Well, what do we mean by post-truth? Well, it's a word that entered the Oxford Dictionary in 2016, I believe, after the infamous 2016 election. And Oxford defined it as when objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Post-truth. Do you get a sense of what that's kind of like, what we're dealing with today? We kind of live in a post-truth world where we're arguing about facts of all things. So we're going to kind of dig into some of that in this course. And a key idea, we'll open this up, is that humans, we are a cognitive species that depends on explanations of the world. Knowledge is critical to what it means to be human. We've evolved to know the world increasingly more and more. And this is a note from Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now, that we'll be looking at in our last class. He says, since the world is the way it is, regardless of what people believe about it, there is a strong selection pressure for an ability to develop explanations that are true. There's a powerful evolutionary force for us to find explanations that are true about the world, as opposed to explanations that are not true, because false explanations tend to not be very helpful in our survival. And so that's what critical thinking is all about. Again, objective analysis and evaluation designed to form good judgment. And this word objective kind of ought to stick out at you because, again, that's kind of the problem we have today. How do we know what's true? How can we objectively understand the world as opposed to just kind of our own subjective notions about it? So this first class, we're going to lay some foundations. I'm going to start, Marla usually starts, but I'm going to start tonight with some really basic science, a section called Feeling Machines That Think. We're going to look at how minds make behavior. And then we'll take a break, let you get some coffee and what have you, and then Marla's going to come and she's going to talk about know thyself, what gets in the way of thinking. Now, those of you who were here Tuesday night, I pulled up one of my favorite critical thinkers, Tom Sowell, who teaches at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, a great critical thinker. This is something we use throughout our talks. He says some things are believed because they are demonstrably true, but many things are believed because they've been asserted repeatedly. A lot of people, their idea of what's true is just kind of what they've heard over and over again. And we saw a film, a short little clip Tuesday night about cognitive ease, how we tend to believe things based upon how many times we hear them. We get a lot of repetitious information. You know, it kind of forms a sense in which, oh, that's true for me. But what Saul points out is that we really need to look at what is demonstrably true, what we can demonstrate as true. And we'll open up that idea up a little bit more in one of our in the last class. But there's an important qualifier: demonstrably true within the limits of our thinking. We're going to spend a lot of time in this in these classes looking at the limits of our thinking. That it's very difficult to know the truth. We have to really work at it, and there are a lot of obstacles that get in the way. And I want to begin as a kind of an introduction to lay a foundation. I want to lay out 3 facts of life, just so that we know that we're all kind of on the same page. And these are things that are demonstrably true within the limits of our thinking, because you will get people that will debate, well, people will debate just about everything nowadays. But these are 3 important facts of life. First, minds evolved. Second, minds come pre-wired. And last, minds share a common nature. So I want to open up these 3 facts of life, because they're going to ground everything that we talk about for the next 3 classes. And to start, who knows what a kludge is? A kludge. Well, a kludge is an ill-assorted collection of parts assembled to fulfill a particular purpose. It's an ill-assorted collection of parts. How many have seen the show MacGyver? Right. Well, MacGyver, here's the guy who's rushing to keep the bomb from going off. He's got, 45 seconds. And he doesn't have a proper kit, a proper toolkit to stop the bomb from detonating. So he has to find whatever is lying around. He may find a piece of bubble gum. He may find a candy bar. He likes to use a paperclip. There's a great YouTube video that has 50 instances of how MacGyver saved the day with a paperclip. Well, what MacGyver's doing is he's building a kludge. It's an ill-assorted collection of parts assembled to fulfill a particular purpose. It's kind of taking all the stuff that's lying around to practically solve the problem. And Gary Marcus, who wrote this book I've been holding here, Gary Marcus, who's one of our leading brain scientists, he says that that's kind of a great way to explain the brain. The brain is a kludge. The subtitle of his book is The Haphazard Construction of the Human Mind. He defines kludge as a solution that is clumsy or inelegant, yet surprisingly effective. It's a collection of lots of little bits that evolved over time to accomplish a very practical purpose. It didn't come designed in a box. Didn't come designed with all nicely working engineered parts. There's no intelligent designer that you can see in the mix. It doesn't look like a computer that has all the parts in the right order. And that's because our minds evolved by natural selection. And this is the most basic fact of life. Our minds didn't just come down from the sky, kind of ready to go. They evolved over millions of years, as Charles Darwin noted. And E.O. Wilson, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his book on human nature, he says the brain exists because it promotes the survival and multiplication of the genes that direct its assembly. The human mind is a device for survival and reproduction. This is the most basic fact of life. We're wired to survive. And Marla is going to open that up in a very practical, not abstract, theoretical way in terms of how we actually deal with reality on an individual basis after the break. We have adapted minds. This is from John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, who are the founders of what's called evolutionary psychology. They write, the brain is a physical system. It functions like a computer to process information. Different neural circuits are specialized for solving different adaptive problems. Our brains weren't designed to do math and poetry and calculus and all those wonderful things that we do with them now. No, our brains were designed to adapt to our environment. We have evolved minds. They go on to say our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind, which is something we're going to look at in our next class, by the way. But the second fact of life, not only did our minds evolve, our brains, our minds evolve, but minds come pre-wired. That is, they are organized in advance of experience. And again, Gary Marcus' wonderful book, this is one of my favorite books, called The Birth of the Mind. The subtitle, How a Tiny Number of Genes Create the Complexities of Human Thought, with a nice introduction from Noam Chomsky. He says, again, they come pre-wired. They are organized in advance of experience. Nature provides a first draft, and then nurture revises it, much like the relationship between genes and what we call epigenetics. And this means, coming to the third fact, that minds share a nature, a common nature. Humans have a human nature that has its source in our minds. We're not blank slates. Coming back to Steven Pinker again, whose book, The Blank Slate, really changed people's thinking about this, because it's important to understand, if you're my age, if you went to college and what have you in, say, the 1970s or even into the 1980s, people didn't understand all these things. You know, the things that I just kind of laid out for you, many of those things have only come online in the last 20, 30 years as we've developed neuroscience, cognitive psychology. Didn't have those things in the college curriculum when I was going to college. And one of the good things is now we know that minds share a common nature, that we have an onboard operating system that is universal and innate. You could say, you could say there's such a thing as kind of iOS Homo sapien. And again, it's important to understand these things because we're going to be talking about how our minds play tricks on us. We're going to be looking at cognitive biases. We're going to be looking at all these things. And so these three foundations are really, really important. That nature provides the foundation for human behavior. Not so much the environment. People used to think it was all the environment. It was all about learning. And while the environment and learning is critical and it's important in the particulars of who we are, what happens inside our heads is what primarily first at the start really matters. So we need to begin by understanding these three basic facts of life: that minds evolved, that minds come pre-wired, and that minds share a common nature. So that was the introduction. I'm going to move on to my bit, and this should only take about 20 minutes. Let's look at the first entry point to this course, and that is, we are feeling machines that think, how minds make behavior. And for this section, I'm going to be using two groundbreaking books. One first from Antonio Damasio, his book Descartes' Error, came out in the end of the 1990s, revolutionized what we understood about rationality and it as opposed to emotions. And the second is Nobel Prize winning author Daniel Kahneman's work, Thinking Fast and Slow. We're going to draw upon these two really seminal thinkers to understand how minds make behavior. And I've got three questions that we're going to open up. What is mind? Why do we have minds? And how do thoughts come to minds? What is mind? Important question to start with. Why do we have minds? And how do thoughts come to minds? First, what is mind? What do we mean by mind? Because again, critical thinking is something that we do with our minds. Well, what is mind? Well, if you talk to a neuroscientist, they'll say, well, that's mind. That's what mind is right there. That, of course, is a brain, right? Mind is an emergent property of the brain and nervous system. It's an emergent property, an organic psychological phenomena which emerges from the neurobiological phenomena of living things. If you're familiar with this idea of emergence, something that is emergence. Something that is an emergent is something that comes from the collection. It's the condition of something having properties its parts do not individually have due to interactions among the parts. It's when a bunch of things come together and they form something that is more than the sum of the things, individual things. It's like a hurricane. A hurricane happens when there are a number of phenomena come together. And when all those things come together, you get this thing called a hurricane. But you can't point to one thing and say, that's a hurricane. It's the sum of the parts. You have to have all the parts. And when all the parts come together, all the different phenomena that make up a hurricane come together, the hurricane is an emergent property of all those different things. And that's what the brain is. The brain is an emergent property, the mind is an emergent property of the brain and the nervous system. It's what you get when all the bits that are working in our brains come together and are functioning. What you get is mind. And you can see it. This is over here on the left. This is a museum display. This is the brain nervous system. You see the brain up there, but look at throughout the entire body, the nervous system. This is mind, this whole thing here. Not this thing, just this thing in the skull. It's not just the brain that's in the skull. This is a painting that kind of looks at the same kind of thing. Because again, mind is a process, not a thing. Mind is the software that sits on top of the central nervous system, especially the brain. Mind extends throughout our body, not simply in our heads. Again, this is mind. It's every bit of us is mind in that sense. And I want to show you a quick video of Antonio Damasio explaining this.
You would ask me now, do you believe that minds are created by brains alone? My answer would be no. I don't think that the brain alone is going to be able to do it. Okay, so what else do I want? Well, I want, in the very least, that you have a nervous system, not brain, a nervous system that is inserted inside the body proper, and that together with that body proper generates a living organism. So a mind is never going to be the result of brains alone, or nervous systems alone, or neural whatever alone. It's going to be the result, if it is, until proven otherwise, of an integrated functionality that joins together nervous systems and the rest of the organism, that is the body proper. And so what this creates is something that is very often missed, is that the nervous system is not this little thing that we have, or not so little, inside our skulls, but it's actually a very complex system that is distributed into every nook and cranny of the organism, and is distributed in a dual relationship, because there are neurons that go to every nook and cranny, and there are neurons or signaling that comes from those nooks and crannies all over the body. So there is a very, very complex distribution of this surveillance system, and a very complex arrangement that allows for a huge amount of interaction.
Again, so mind extends through all of us. Every nook and cranny of our being, mind extends. And this is important because Marla is going to be talking about things like triggering and how our minds are intimately involved in our thinking. Our thinking is not just something that takes place in our skulls. Thinking is something that takes place throughout all of our bodies in that sense. So we have to be really careful of how our bodies are working. So again, mind is a process, not a thing. It's an emergent property of the brain and the nervous system. It's what you get when you put all the bits of the brain and the nervous system together as they function individually. The individual parts come together, and what emerges from that is mind. So, well, why do we have minds then? Why do we have minds in the first place? Well, the simple answer, we're not plants. That's the simple answer to the question, why do we have minds? Well, we're not plants. We move around in order to survive. Life came onshore, out of the oceans. We needed to be able to move around in our environment. It wasn't enough just to have a kind of a simple nervous system. We needed to have brains. We needed to have minds. It was something that evolved. And a key idea is that, and think about what Damasio was talking about when he talked about how it's integrated into the body. A key idea is that mind is the idea of the body. Why did we get minds? Well, we're not plants. We have to move around. And mind is the idea of the body. It's a series of mental representations that map the body in space. That's essentially what the mind is. It's kind of like, when you put on your Google Maps. It tracks, your Google Maps, and you're in the car, it tracks you all over the place. Well, that's what our minds evolved for. Mind is the idea of the body. It helps us mentally represent what's going on in order to survive in the environment. And again, you see this going back to these pictures. This is mind. This is why mind extends throughout every cranny of our bodies. Mind is the idea of the body. It helps us map what's going on in space. Mental processes are grounded in the brain's mapping of the body, Damasio says. Collections of neural patterns that portray responses to events that cause emotions and feelings. We have emotions. We have feelings as we're transversing the environment. Mind is the idea of the body. We have emotions, we have feelings, and what have you. They help us survive. They help us know what we should move away from, what we should move towards, what we should attack, what we should defend. Basic processes of life. Mind is the idea of the body. And the goal of all this, and Marla will open this up quite a bit more, the goal of all this, the goal of having these minds that can react to the environment in terms of emotions and feelings and what have you, is to bring us back to a point of homeostasis. All of life, all of our activity, we're trying to find that safe space where we have optimal survival, where all is well, all is regulated normally. But, as Damasio goes on to say, the need to survive in more complex environments led to the evolution of our brains to be able to think. Most life forms that have mind, that have nervous systems, don't necessarily have to think about the world. But humans and other species needed to have more complicated ways of solving problems. And for that, our brains evolved special functionality. Damasio says that we are feeling machines that think. Mind is the idea of the body. We basically feel the world, but we've evolved a capacity to think on top of that basic reality. And again, if you look at the picture, this is a picture of a side view of the brain. You can see the evolution of the brain right in the structure of the brain. Here's the brain stem, the cerebellum. You see how this is all grown on top of one another. We have different layers. This top layer here, the cerebral cortex, this is something that evolved. It has different parts that evolved at different times. Recent brain structures have been added to help minds solve problems that require critical thinking about the world. We have the cerebral cortex. this top part of the brain that has evolved, that evolved later. That's where the source of reasoning and planning, executing, language, cooperating. This is something that was added later. This evolved later, and you can see it in the structure of the brain. Came online probably about 2 million years ago, as opposed to what we call the limbic brain. This is more the limbic area of the brain. In here, these features, these areas in here, those are older. That's where emotion and intuition and motivation take place. That came online about 200 million years ago. And we share that with other mammals. And what's most basic is what we call, it's often called the reptile brain, which is kind of in the brainstem and some of these areas in here. Whoops, there you go. Where we have basic instincts lie, aggression, dominance, and consciousness. Our awareness of the environment is very, very, very old. It's not something that's new. So recent brain structures have been added on to help us solve problems that require critical thinking about the world. This is a chart. This is the kind of chart you'll see if you go online. You see there's the basic 3 parts of the brain, and it's not really, it's not as neat as that if you talk to a neuroscientist. But again, we have the neurocortex. This is what's often called the new brain. This is where we have rational thinking. The limbic brain, where our emotions lie, and the old reptilian brain, where we have the kind of the innate and autonomic or automatic self-preservation behaviors. And Damasio's point in all this is to say that we're feeling machines that think. We feel the world primarily. Thinking is something that is added. It's something that's added after the fact. And it's something that we have to engage because it doesn't always come natural to us. We are feeling machines that think. Last question, and then we'll have time for a little bit of Q&A. How do thoughts come to minds? Well, and again, we're going to go to Daniel Kahneman this time. He says that we have 2 systems of thinking, what he calls System 1, fast thinking, and System 2, slow thinking. And they tend to correspond somewhat to these different areas of the brain. Our slow thinking capacity tends to rely more on the newer brain, and our fast thinking tends to rely a lot more on the limbic and the older brain. System 1. System 1 is what he calls fast thinking. It operates automatically and quickly with little or no effort and no sense of voluntary control. It's what we would call our intuitive system. Our mind assesses a situation and delivers an update to our consciousness, our navigation system. And fast thinking are things that come to mind readily, things that we've learned, things that are intuitive to us, like answering 2 + 2 = 4. It comes right to us. Making a disgust face when shown a horrible picture, or understanding simple kinds of sentences. Some thoughts come to our mind kind of immediately. They just come to us. They're the product of our intuitions. They don't require much effort at all. That's what's called fast thinking. It's this idea of cognitive ease that we'll talk about in later classes. And again, it's rooted more in our intuitive system, which is our part of our older brain. This is the older brain that doesn't rely so much on the newer brain. System 1 relies upon older brain structures we have in common with other primates, mammals, and reptiles. As opposed to System 2, which he calls slow thinking. System 2 is effortful mental activity that demands our attention, including complex computation. It's the source of self-awareness. And importantly, it's a deliberative system. It's a system we draw upon when we do critical thinking, observation, and deliberation. Like filling out a tax form. Why is it so hard to fill out a tax form? Unless you've done it a bazillion times. Filling out a tax is not something that you do quickly, and like I said, unless you've done it a bazillion times. Filling out a tax form requires slow thinking, effortful thinking, thinking that relies upon newer parts of the brain. Monitoring our behavior in a social situation requires deliberation. We have to stop. We have to think about what we're doing. We have to slow down and kind of analyze what's going on. Or something as simple as comparing two washing machines. You go to Costco and you want to see which one do I buy. You can do it intuitively really quick, but if you want to make a good decision, you need to deliberate about it. You need to do comparisons. You need to say, you need to weigh the value and the benefits of each one. This is slow thinking, as Kahneman talks about it. And it relies upon these newer parts of our brain. It relies upon parts of our brain that evolved to help us be critical thinkers in the world as our environments got more complicated. As life got more complicated, we had to develop these massive brains that could deliberate. And that's what he calls the System 2 system. So again, just to finish this out, critical thinking then relies upon this System 2 kind of thinking. It's slow thinking. If you're going to do objective analysis and evaluation designed to form good judgment, you have to slow down. You have to learn to kind of tamp down our emotional, our intuitive processes, our cognitive ease, our emotions and what have you, in order to tap into our more recent brain structures to do this kind of slow thinking. So again, that's kind of this idea. We are feeling machines that think, that our brains have evolved, our minds have evolved, and that we basically feel the world. Our minds started just in very simple environments, getting around the world and responding to the world in terms of emotions and feelings and what have you. And much of life does not require any kind of real thinking. Most species don't have what we have in terms of this massive cerebral cortex. But we have that, and that is there to be able to solve more complicated problems. So as we start to talk about how we become critical thinkers, we have to be mindful of that we're using this part of our brain that's designed for deliberation.
So what we'll do is let's open it up for a few minutes of conversation, of question, Q&A on Rob's part. And break it up.
I know that was a lot of material, and some of it I kind of went through pretty quick. But the main idea is that we're feeling machines that think. We can think, but thinking is something that we have to manually kind of do, because it's something that only came. If you think of humanity as being, Homo sapiens being around for maybe 3 or 4 million years, this kind of thinking has come on very, very recently. And it's one of the reasons why it's so hard. Why it's hard to think. Thinking is really hard. Being reasonable is very hard, because we are emotionally oriented creatures more than we are thinking oriented creatures.
Jordan, did you have a question or a comment?
Excellent job, Rob, laying that out. Great foundation for this. I really appreciate the idea that mind is so much more than we typically think about it in our craniums. That was some great graphics. I've heard, and what's your comment, there are more neurons in our guts or intestinal lining than in our brains. Have you heard this? Is there anything to that?
No, and there's about 88 billion neurons in the brain, or maybe it's 87 billion brains. I've heard that, but I can't verify that that's true. I've heard that. I'm skeptical of that.
I kind of am too, but there's that feeling.
Yeah. But maybe somebody may know.
I think it's actually the production of neurotransmitters is in the gut 80%, not neurons.
There you go. There's your answer. Yeah. There is a book out. There's a book called The Second Brain or something like that gets into that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I'm curious how you start this large conversation with somebody who has a worldview in which they believe we were created some 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, and end of discussion. So, just curious your thoughts on that.
Funny you should ask that.
Okay.
Well, because I often when we do this in our public talks, we often begin with comparing different ways that people look at the minds. Because you're right. I'm a former Christian pastor, and for most of my adult life, that's what I believed. So how do you start the conversation? I would say for somebody who has a faith commitment, that commitment kind of trumps everything else. Faith is the evidence of things not seen. What I was trying to get at the beginning is that we're going to be talking about demonstrable claims. And that's not to say that they're the only claims. There are a lot of claims that science can't, there are a lot of things that science, can't really speak to. So we kind of stick with, this is what the science is. And we do get a lot of Christians in our talks who come in who don't believe in evolution. And generally what I tell them is, that's fine. Try and suspend your judgment and at least understand how, from the perspective of modern science, we understand how this happens. And most of the time I find Christians are interested at least because one option for them is that, well, maybe this is how God put it together. Maybe God, put the recipe in the DNA, and that evolution is just the working out of that. And there are a lot of evangelicals today. There's the BioLogos group down in Southern California, I believe, that believe in what they call theistic evolution. And sometimes that's a great bridge, to talk about this. But yeah, I think you really have to begin with kind of saying, these are basic facts of life that we're going to build on. And kind of go with the argument, because I think what I'm hoping is that by the end of a long discussion, a number of classes looking at this stuff, people will begin to see, oh yeah, there really is good evidence that this is how human minds developed. I don't know if that answered your question, but yeah, we run into it quite a bit.
Mm-hmm. In another one of our classes, we get more into worldview and belief and how we can try to hold both and, because it's the things that can be proven and seen and unproven and unseen. So it's really tricky territory.
Yeah, and I think when we went through this material the first time in this class, we talked a little bit about that because we had a lot of questions at the presentation, and so we did kind of say, bear in mind that we're coming from a kind of a scientific perspective. There are other perspectives out there, and but take some time, take this one in, understand it, learn it, even if you disagree with it. I think in general, when it comes to, because again, we do a lot of political talks about our politics, we always encourage people, understand the other view. Really understand the other view, because if you really think you're right about something, understanding the other side is the best way to be able to engage someone on the other side, because they'll know that you're kind of connecting with what they're really believing about the world.
Yeah, sorry.
So on the definition of critical thinking that you gave, to me, one thing that struck me is how it's really focused on intake and perception, and given your guys' work on political disagreements, so much of that is pertains to our individual outputs and not just our intakes. It's like how we convey what we've taken in as critical thought, processed, and then put something else out. And I guess I'm wondering if you have some ideas about like what's the part of critical thinking that pertains to our output?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I'd have to think about that a little bit. Because right off the bat, nothing's coming to me. Because, are you going to? Once when we do our long courses, for example, we begin with critical thinking in terms of think for yourself, And then we move on to a piece that we call deliberative democracy, which is think with others. How do you then persuade somebody else? How do you use reason and arguments and evidence to be able to present a point of view to someone else? And then how does that process work, together, back and forth, where we're having dialogue and debate, and we're working and we're trying to find consilience, which is an idea that we use a lot. Is that kind of what you're? Is that something like what you're talking about?
Yeah, I think so. But I mean, I think just from what I saw, like, it sounds like one thing you're pushing for is like, if we're going to be critical thinkers, let's be honest, objective, thoughtful deliberators, right? And but you can do all that and then still be then you can still put something back into the world that is dishonest.
Well,
well,
like,
and then,
Without even knowing.
yeah, and to me, and Marla's we'll talk about that. That's the role. It's got to be, think for yourself, think with others.
Yeah.
There's got to be that next step, I would say, where, and we'll get into a piece in the last class when we talk about how science works, the importance of deliberation, the importance of, peer review and people coming together, that, the idea that facts are a great way to make ideas accountable, and that's something that's kind of a communal process. Because you're right, critical thinking has to get beyond just what's happening in my head to kind of what's happening collectively, I would say.
well, and I'll be curious, hold the question again when I go through my bit, because how I'm interpreting your comment is also, and maybe this is my own projection, is like how my own psychological stuff might get in the way of how I present it to the world, or how it might skew also my view. So let's come back to it at the end again and see with a little more.
But it's really important.
more-
What you're saying is really
Yeah.
important. Yeah.
I agree. That's a really great point you brought up.
Yeah.
Especially the piece, and without even needing to, without even going to.
And then, the whole thing about, to piggyback, go further from what Rob said, to persuade others, but I need to be ready to be persuadable too. Like, one thing I've learned from doing these talks for the last 2 years is changing minds is a two-way street. And so there's that deep communication where if I am open and I've looked at my triggers and all that, which we'll see in the next half, there's more likelihood that there's a real cross-pollination. So I think what we should do now is take a break till 8, and then we'll come back and I'll do my bit. So there's refreshments back there, and also all the books that we talk about are here on the shelves, on that shelf right near you. I'm blanking. Linda? Robin, sorry. Close.
Close. You're way off.
Two syllables. And the third week I'll be doing the cognitive biases. So what I really want to say, and really piggybacking off of Rob, all these things come pre-wired. So what they need is awareness and what we call a manual override. We need to catch ourselves in these processes, and we'll go through that. I'll repeat that a million times because I think it's really important. So when I talk about triggering and our defense mechanisms, those are part of our operating systems. And again, like Rob was saying about homeostasis, we will do what we need to do automatically to regain homeostasis, which is this feeling of no threat, calm, safe, kind of like everything's okay with the world. And organisms, even starting from amoebas, do the same thing. If you put a dot of vinegar on them, they'll disintegrate and then do everything they can to reintegrate. So, for example, meditators, long-term meditators, can get themselves to homeostasis more easily, but there's ways to develop that for ourselves as well. So one thing that Freud came up with is that he said, we will move away from pain and towards non-pain. He called it pleasure, but I think non-pain is even more to the point. So we're really always orienting ourselves to these things. So that's why even a point of view can feel threatening, and we want to move away from that. So as Rob said, we're wired for survival, and we're always moving towards what our nervous system feels as safe. But going back to what Rob was saying about the Stone Age minds, it can even go deeper than that and more existential. So for instance, not to bring it too much into politics, but when there's issues like healthcare and things like that that actually make people unconsciously afraid of their survival, there's something very deep and old that gets constellated from that reptilian brain, like the survival fears. So like they were saying, triggering occurs when something stimulates this strong reaction to a real or perceived threat. And what's really important to remember is that our body responds, our nervous system, our feeling about what's going on, responds to an imagined threat as well as a real one. It doesn't know the difference. So that's one of the things that I do when I'm feeling triggered and anxious. It's like, what is really the threat right now? Is it more in here? Is there a bear chasing me? You know, or does somebody have a knife to my throat? So that's one of the tricks. Because what happens is when the amygdala gets triggered, that's like our part of our threat detection circuitry. It cuts off communication with that neocortex, so we can't think. I mean, has anybody here been so panicked and triggered that they haven't been able to think? I get lost really easily, and I cannot think my way out of the problem. I feel like even more than a young child, I feel almost like a frightened animal. It's very, very instinctive. So I want to talk about the 4 Fs and the fight, flight, or freeze, which is I've added, or other people have added on fawn, which I'll explain in a minute. And when we're triggered in these ways, our ability to think, like I said, is really compromised when we feel threatened in this way. So it's maladaptive now most of the time, because we usually don't have a saber-toothed tiger chasing us or things like that. There's much of the threat we feel isn't really in the room. It's in our minds. So here's a very good graph that Rob found, and I'll go through the 4 Fs. So fight is when we want to defend ourselves, when we want to push back. They put it here, can't hear other points of view, explosive temper, bullying, demanding perfection, those kind of things. Flight is when you either leave physically, or you might leave emotionally or psychologically. So you might dissociate, you might always on the go, always be busy, find ways to get away from whatever that stimulus is that's making you afraid. Freeze is a really difficult, the most difficult, they say, of the 4 trauma trigger responses, because you can literally be paralyzed. So that's something that I do. That's my first response usually, and I've learned just to move an arm or something, just start moving something. And that really helps me get out of that deer in the headlights place. And then fawning is something has been added on more recently, which is, you know about the Stockholm Syndrome, where people bond with their captors, or some people say that children do that with their parents. It's a kind of Stockholm Syndrome there too. But it can be, you know, if I'm feeling threatened, I might fawn, kowtow, try to please the other to make that connection to feel more safe. I might flatter the person. And so what I think in this, what I want to start doing with y'all is making a little map of our triggered responses. So for instance, my stack up, first I'll go to freeze, then I will go to fawn. So I'll freeze, and then if we're having something to a problem, I'll try to flatter you or say I love you or touch your arm, but it's not in a genuine way. It's in a self-protective, no offense. It's in a self-protective way, you know, it's like I'm trying to strategize so I feel safe. And the third one is flight. I'll try to get away or I'll dissociate. And if I have to, I will fight. It's only when I'm pushed into a corner I'll do that. So I think just take a few minutes right now and write your stack up, because it's important, like in the video we saw, it's really important to notice, to understand when we're getting triggered, because in the whole context of learning how to think or thinking better, we cannot think when we're in those states. We're on autopilot. So just take a couple minutes. You don't have to share it with anybody. So, and as you're thinking about this, are you getting a sense of how those might hijack you or hijack your ability to think when they happen, if you think of certain specific experiences? So, like I said, all this is on autopilot. It bypasses our rational thought, and it often feels like death or like something big is at stake. Can feel like life or death. I was having this discussion with someone a couple of years ago about politics, as it turns out. And she at one point, she looked at me and she said, "Why do I feel as if my very life is at stake for me to convince you that I'm right?" And she had that aha moment, like, wow, this is really constellating my survival fears. And that's what we have to catch ourselves doing, I believe. So, and I've given you a handout too, because someone asked for it in the last class, some tricks about how to get back to more calming, to homeostasis, and we need to learn to self-regulate. And this is, you know, in any area, with our spouses, with our families, with our colleagues at work, all of these things we need to be able to do, to be able to think and communicate clearly with those around us. And again, we're overriding our biology when we're doing this, because our whole biology, as Rob was talking about, how we're wired to survive. And if I'm not going with my instincts about fleeing or fighting and saying, I'm going to calm down, I'm actually overriding my own biology. And that's a big deal. It takes a lot of skill and steadfastness and courage too. So, just for right now, just call out some answers. How do you know when you're triggered? And I'll give extra credit. Palpitation? Okay. What else?
What's the extra credit?
A gold star. Brain fog, yeah. That's, again, to my point,
That's right.
can't think.
Well, it's breaking that connection.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Worry, yeah. Sad? Stomach churning. This is good because I see you're tracking sensations, feelings, sensations, as well as emotions.
I'll catch myself micromanaging the possible outcomes.
Trying to get back in control, right? Yeah.
Nice.
Good noticing.
Yeah.
So that's
Really good
behavior.
noticing. Yeah, yeah.
Some people describe it as a sense of whoosh, or being hijacked or flooded by their emotions, going from 0 to 100 in a nanosecond, you know, with anger, knee-jerk reactions, that kind of thing.
Race to the bottom of the brainstem.
Race to the bottom of the brainstem, yeah. So that leads me to the next topic, which are defenses. And, you know, I'm going over this rather quickly, but it could be a week-long workshop to start unpacking all these things. But it's just to get you started in thinking about this. So as soon as I'm triggered, then my defenses come online, right? And remember, we're wired to survive, so we're going to defend ourselves and self-protect ourselves. And one way of looking at being defended is the opposite of being vulnerable. vulnerable to hurt, vulnerable to potential death somewhere. And it's not, I also want to say that it's not that defense mechanisms in and of themselves are bad. So what I'm talking about is the automatic nature. So for instance, I have a stepmother who in the past, now we're actually really good, but in the past, every time I would tell her something very personal about myself, she'd bring it up eventually as some kind of ammunition. So instead of just going on automatic, like, okay, I'm never, you know, the kind of fleeing, I decided to consciously just not share with her. Can you see the difference? It's a wise choice. And it's like, so, and for instance, like with a fireman who's maybe, that was really funny. Who maybe was having, you know, family troubles before the fire, right? You want him to compartmentalize. You want him to say, I'm putting that aside for now. And that's one of the, I think there's 12 primary defense mechanisms. Compartmentalization is one of them, which is like putting these things aside. The problem is most people put things aside and they stay there, like their emotions or their sadness or any kind of thing, right? But for me to say, right now I've got to function on a certain level, so I'm going to put that aside for now. And another one that Freud pointed out, which could be very healthy, was sublimation, which means instead of, if I got mad at work, instead of kicking the dog, I'd go run around the block a few times, right? So it's a way to acknowledge the energy but do something else with it. So I don't want to categorically say don't have defense mechanisms, and sometimes we do need them. But if we choose them, it's a lot better. And again, when we're in a defended mode, we're not fully thinking. We can't think critically because we're busy strategizing how to get to safety. There's another huge topic of defense mechanism called psychological splitting, which some of you might know about. And basically, it's kind of the black and white thinking, like it could be I'm right, you're wrong, I'm good, you're bad, these people are all bad, these people are all good. This way we have of not seeing the world as nuanced. And we start off like that because our young psyches don't have the capacity at that point. And normally, for a lot of therapists with their clients, it's like when their client is able to see nuance and that mom was both good and bad, not just bad, for example, that there's real progress. And my opinion, this is not a fact, this is an opinion, is that many adults who are chronological adults haven't reached that kind of maturity. But doing these kind of things gets us to there, gets us to a more nuanced, a broader view of people and groups and things like that. And more working towards the both and than the either or. So when we split like that, we can't take in the whole picture, and we need to take in as big a picture as we can to think critically about things. So we're going to do a little exercise now too. I'm going to hand out this list of, thank you, of defense mechanisms. Now there might be ones that you employ that aren't on there. Just write them in by hand. So the exercise is to circle your 5 favorites, the 5 that you're more apt to use. And just to give you some examples, for me, crying is a big defense. Like when I feel threatened, I'll start crying. It's like, don't hurt me, don't hurt me. You know, yeah. And it also covers my anger. Some people's anger covers their hurt. Another thing I do is I get really tired. When there's something I don't want to deal with or want to push away, I'll just feel like the vampire sucked my blood out. And they call that somatization. And another one I use a lot in the past especially is grandiosity. I'd inflate myself so I'd kind of try to feel superior to another person. That made me feel safer. So look at the list and take a few minutes and see what you think. minute. My ex-husband and I, and we're really close, we did something recently where we told each other what we thought the other's defense mechanisms were, which was really helpful. Yeah. Yeah. No, it was fine, because, yeah, we've been divorced a long time. Oh, yeah. I mean, he really, I mean, every time he said something about me, I started laughing. He nailed it, you know, because I think a lot of times others can see us a lot better than we can see ourselves. And it was all done in a really loving way. So we were joking about it and things like that. It's actually kind of fun. But he wasn't a fireman ever.
I don't know what the joke is.
No, I teased one time we were talking about renting a space at the fire department. I said, "Ooh, I like firemen," so now that's one of our running jokes. We have a few now. It's getting really juicy. So I want to cover, oh, well, first of all, does anyone want to share anything about, you're not obliged to, but sometimes if people have an aha, like, oh, I never thought about this, you're free to share with the group. Jordan.
Well, I'm not sharing necessarily.
Okay.
Some of these feel like they're just completely universal, though. Like, are any of them universal?
Universal in terms of
everybody would experience.
Well, I think yes, but for me it's like finding out which are my favorite, which are the ones I use the most. But yeah, it depends on the context, right? And
Context, yeah.
don't you think? Okay, well, I want to talk about one more thing that can get in the way of our thinking, and that is the kind of us versus them mentality, or what's called in-group, out-group. So the in-group represents safety, and the out-group can represent, again, you know, real or imagined, a threat. And I really want to keep bringing this back to how this impinges on our survival security. Alan Jacobs, who wrote the book How to Think, which is here in this library, he said the problem of belonging and not belonging is central to learning how to think. He goes on, survival is contingent on belonging, and belonging is contingent on conformity. So again, you know, we're dependent on others, and we have these family affiliations, group affiliations, organization affiliations, things that are wired into us to feel safe when we're in a group that is like-minded and have each other's backs. Now, the problem, especially these days, is there's a kind of groupthink around that. And I know, just as an example, when I started changing my political place on the spectrum, certain people that I identified with as my tribe before kind of unfriended me. So it brought up a lot of anxiety, but how am I going to stay true to myself if I'm kind of held hostage to being and belonging to a group? And Brene Brown's book, which is also here, called Braving the Wilderness, she talks about having to leave our ideological bunkers and belong to ourselves, have a strong sense of belonging to ourselves so that we can afford to go against the common thought in our groups. And this brings me to the idea of groupthink, that was coined, a phrase that was coined by George Orwell in his book 1984, when pressure for conformity within a group becomes so powerful that it suppresses dissent and the ability to consider alternatives. So we're not free to think for ourselves. And we do have people at our talks who come up and say, you know, I've been questioning my side, but I'm afraid to say it to my group because I'm afraid of being unfriended. And I see what happens. It's not an unfounded fear, but how important it is. I mean, when I started doing this work, I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking, I'm going to lose the house. Completely just the survival thing that didn't have to do with reality, but it was as if it were real. So again, and I couldn't think. I had to calm down to be able to reason that I'm not going to lose the house. I might lose the house, but not because I have a different political belief than other people. So we can be afraid to think for ourselves because we might be banished or punished by our group or team or organization or family. So what can we do? I want to end with this. And I need to really catch myself in the act. When I'm triggered, when I'm defensive, when I'm in this in-group, out-group mentality. And how I like to talk about it is all the things I've talked about tonight are on this automatic system. It's left to its own devices that will keep going. And what's also very telling is a lot of people identify, well, that's just how I am, who I am. And it's more like that's how I am. But there's that problem with identification too. But if I can use my mindfulness, my conscious awareness to drive a cog of awareness into this automatic system, you know, to block it and say, oh, I get it, I'm triggered right now. Let me go take a walk and get some fresh air. Or let me sleep on it. Or, oh my gosh, I'm so defensive, I've frozen and I can't respond to Jordan right now. I need to self-regulate so I can get back to the conversation and I can think about what's going on here. In that way, we create choice points. And my point of view is that when we're on autopilot, we don't have a choice. We're not at choice. But if I can break the system and then say I have a choice point, I can leave the room or I can stay here and finish my discussion with Linda, you know, and I can think about what's going on. And I can do what I need to do to self-regulate. And so, again, we're going to say this a lot in all the talks. I think we're wired to survive. So we need to delaminate our behavior from that survival instinct and realize there's no bear chasing me or there's not a knife to my throat right now. I'm okay right now. And to be able to think and to be able to behave differently. So what you started doing tonight is kind of making a map. Know when I'm triggered, know when my defense mechanisms are activated and what they are. Know when I'm in an in-group, out-group mode, and when I'm in black and white thinking mode. And good ways to break this is to pause, take 10, sleep on it, breathe. Another really good one is don't push send. Right? I mean, I sent so many emails late at night in just a knee-jerk reaction, and in the morning rereading everything, and I thought I really jumped to a conclusion, or I got defensive here. To learn how to self-regulate and to calm our nervous systems. I've got a list of ideas on one of your handouts. People call them self-management opportunities. So for me, I know a bath works, or music, or different things, just to get back to feeling okay. And I want to end this presentation with a quote from Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. He spent many years in a concentration camp and wrote this beautiful book. He said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom and our ability to think better. And that's it. So we'll open it up for Q&A. We've got about 25 minutes. And before we do, if we could just go around, since we're going to be now in discussion, and say your name and really one sentence why you decided to come tonight, so we get a feeling of why people are here. Do you mind starting, David?
So I'm David Lane, been in Ashland for 42 years now, and I like to think of myself as being somewhat of an intellectual and thinking things through. So the idea of learning how to think better was intriguing.
Thank you.
Nice.
I'm Linda Goodyear Stevenson, and I've been here 48 years, for a long time. And it was interesting. It's not really why I came, but it's what I've learned tonight. I felt triggered and frozen and things like that, and acquiesced to others. And it was really interesting tonight to learn that most of us do that. And it will make me much more compassionate, I think, rather than feeling all that fear and figuring out what to do with it, to think, let me just be calm and take a time out and then think about the others and how they might be.
That's beautiful. And you reminded me, one of the things that I learned early on is that when I could face anybody, no matter what they were saying or how they were acting, is they just want to feel safe. The way they're going about it wouldn't be my way, but it really, thank you for bringing that into the room, because it really brings a lot of compassion. It calms me down too, and compassion for myself when I want to feel safe too. Thank you. Ari.
My name's Ari Lou, and I mean, I'm from Oregon. I was born and raised in Portland, and yeah, I just, you know, I don't know. I've been living in Breckenridge, Colorado, and this is a bit not enough of things like this. And so I saw this flyer, and I'm moving back here, and I was just really excited. So I'm gonna come be intellectual.
Nice.
Every day.
Nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
There you go, Jordan. It's the Rogue Valley Intellectual Library.
And?
Well, I'm Jordan Pease, and I commissioned these lectures, and we're just so delighted to have these awesome people presenting this awesome material. Why am I here? Well, because see above. But I'm getting so much out of this, of course, too. So I just leave this up. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Geraldine Orozco, and I'm from California. I work daily with trauma therapy, doing DNA reprogramming, so this is something that's so important. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thanks. Thank you.
Didn't know that's what you did. Interesting.
Yeah, perfect. It's right up my alley.
Yeah, good.
I'm Denise Ross, and Marla and Rob filmed some of their presentations.
Thank you.
I'm Robin Whitaker, and I've been in Ashland for about 20 years, and I've been studying kind of lightly Buddhism for a while, meditation, and I'm trying to be a more conscious person. And also I found myself, like, especially after the 2016 elections, feeling very triggered by what's going on politically, and how there's just such a breakdown. People cannot communicate rationally, and I wanted to be able to learn how to do that and have dialogue with more people.
There's a great book, probably just down from you, about from Robert Wright about Buddhism.
Right.
And Robert,
Why Buddhism is true.
great book, because Robert Wright wrote one of the first popular books on evolutionary psychology in the 1990s that began to touch on some of this stuff. And he's discovered, like so many people, that Buddhism has a lot of rich knowledge that really, comes, together with what we're learning in neuroscience today. So they really do come together in a really nice way.
And he has, if you Google him and maybe say the political divide, something like that, he's written articles about how meditation helps with the divide. So
he has a newsletter called Mindful Resistance. He's somebody who's a Democrat. He's on the left, but he's trying to get folks in that world to channel that triggering that people feel into something maybe that can be really constructive to change things. So yeah, I'd recommend. He's also really funny. So.
And Jeff.
My name is Jeffrey Nagel. I've been here about 5 years. It occurs to me I could give you 100 different answers for why I'm here. This evening I feel like the answer is that I've not been successful at having a number of conversations with people that I would like to have, and I'm hoping that this course series will provide me some access points and some on-routes, on-ramps, there we go, some on-ramps to start those conversations.
And may I ask, are those political or
Political and religious.
Oh, okay, that's your question.
Right down our alley.
Because I'm wondering, because knowing that I might give you resources, because we won't be. There's lots of people in the U.S. Doing, learning, teaching how to have civil conversations and bridging kind of conversations. So I'll try to also. We won't be doing that in this class, but all of this will help, because I think all of it starts here. So as much as I can get myself calm and have more of a critical thinking, get my filters out of the way best I can, it helps, because then it helps de-escalate. And the other person, I think, calibrates to my nervous system too. If I stay calm, the chances are they're going to stay calm too. So thank you.
Well, and a shameless plug, you know, what we our normal talks, you know, really what we focus on is getting people to understand how people on the left, on the right, people who are religious, who are, you know, particularly Christian fundamentalists, as opposed to, you know, how people can have conversations by understanding with, you know, where people are coming from. So we dig into a lot of that stuff. You know, we'll probably touch here and there on some of that in a practical way. Yeah.
Good, thanks. Nikki, you want to?
I'm Nikki Clifton. I'm the event coordinator for the library here. And I'm interested in this class because I'm exposed to so much information here in this library. It can be overwhelming. And so this is helping me, give me some framework to choose the things that I read and to be able to, you know, discern.
Yep.
And I've taken a lot of different personal development classes over the years, but I've never, you know, in high school, in college, and all these different classes, I've never been exposed to really critical thinking. So this is kind of a new concept for me. So
Oh, good,
really
good.
interesting. Yeah.
Thanks.
And I was thinking, our approach is probably a little different than other approaches because we really try and start at what we think is the very, very beginning. Because thinking is a process that involves the whole of us, and if we're not aware of all the things that are going on with our emotions and what have you, you know, we're not going to be critical thinkers. I think oftentimes when you get a critical thinking class, they begin by talking about logic and, you know, and how to make an argument, and those things are important. But people don't change their minds if you have someone you're talking to and you think, my gosh, they have no idea what they're, and you want to be able to kind of persuade them to see the world a little bit differently. Facts tend to not change people's minds off the bat. It's more the personal, it's more the how people feel when you're having an engagement with them. And so, you know, we always start with these kinds of things particularly when we talk about politics and whatnot.
Is that a hand up?
Question?
Yeah.
Well, you touched on a pretty big subject there, Bob.
Whoops.
Well, in a good way, but this is, I doubt you could answer this one succinctly, but let's try. Because you made the point, like, you know, I want to change that person's mind. What is that impulse within us to want to do that?
Well, I think part of it goes back to the little quote from Steve Pinker earlier. You know, this idea that we are, what is unique about Homo sapiens, the evolutionary psychologists would say, is that we've entered the cognitive niche, that we've developed this ability to think and to acquire knowledge. And with that knowledge, tools and technology and the ability to cooperate. Next week, we'll look at Stone Age minds, how this long period of human development, what we call the Stone Age, the Paleolithic era, our minds were developing through this amazing cooperative ability that we've scaled up over thousands of years to where now we have this. And this all came by a desire we have to know, to understand the world, to be able to solve real problems and what have you. So I think there is a kind of a drive that we have. It's a kind of a survival drive to acquire knowledge. And then when we encounter somebody else, here's the other person, and it's like, you don't know. You know, I think we have a desire to persuade.
My question is, though, so
Yeah.
I get the first part very much.
Yeah.
I get the first part very much,
Yeah.
especially evolutionary reasons for that. But then that whole idea, I'm right, you're wrong, and this need to convince them.
I think the thing is that also to be open to be persuadable. I think it's getting back to how this has to be a conciliant conversation, and that's, to me, that's a further evolution of that initial. And you're going to talk about motivated reasoning, right?
Yeah, and also in the last class, granted it's the last class, we're going to look at science in terms of what science really does. Is it creates the climate for I put forward my idea, somebody else comes and counters that idea. This is how we get knowledge. It's by people coming together with different ideas, sharpening. Iron sharpens iron. You know, these kinds of things. Again, the United States, we'll talk about this a little bit, was founded out of the Enlightenment as a deliberative democracy. It wasn't enough just that people voted. They expected that people would be knowledgeable. This is why we have free speech as the first article of our Bill of Rights, is free speech, because it's through free speech. It's through, people arguing, I don't mean arguing and, yelling at each other, but people providing reasons. This is how we obtain knowledge, and knowledge really does have the ability to transform the world for the better. It can also do damage. But everything that we have today that we think of as being really helpful and beneficial for flourishing has come about through the acquisition of knowledge, which is a communal process, not just something that happens in my head, but it's something that has to happen when we come together and we have these deliberations and whatnot.
Earlier, and I think it was you, Marla, who mentioned that, or someone, might have been an audience member, that in order to have this coming together and sharing and exploring ideas, both parties need to come with that open mind and with the idea of, what do you have to contribute to me? And I think where the difficulty comes is with people who believe that what they have is the truth and want to share it, but not hear that there might be something that's different. I think that, for me, is where the problem comes in being able to share ideas.
It's true. We're going to get into part of what you're talking about next week when we do our need to be right and our reticence or our aversion to not knowing or not being certain or being wrong. So we're going to go into part of why that's a problem. But I think all these things that I'm talking about, the personal psychology area, all of those make this kind of netting, right? That really makes it difficult to hear other points of view. So anything we can do about self-awareness, just increment by increment, I think helps bring about what you're talking about, because we have to be able to do that, whether it's in our families or our societies. How do we really become more open-minded and not just give lip service to being open-minded and tolerant? Yeah, David?
So I wanted to sort of answer your question back there and build on what Linda said. We have a need to try and be right and convince other people that we are right. And in the area of science, then we have something objective to hang that on. But in the area of belief, of religion, we can build that sense of being right if more and more people believe the way I believe. And hence we have people going off to convert others, going off on mission trips to carry the word.
Dogma. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're gonna focus a lot on that next week. That's going to be the focus of our of our next class, being right, and this idea of motivated reasoning that will open up, which really plays to what's going on with the religious, the dogmatic kind of mind. And today, we think of religion as traditional, Christian, Islam, but religion kind of runs on a set of software that works outside of what we think of as traditional religious environments. There are a lot of social movements. I was involved heavily in a climate change work. And let me tell you, and I had just come out of my Christian experience, and one of the things that I noticed was there wasn't a lot of difference between the kind of dogmatism and proselytization that we were doing as Christians and what I was involved with in this particular activist group. And not just to pick on that kind of a subject, but anytime you get a group of people together that are united around changing the world and doing better and doing good, you run the risk of this kind of groupthink. That you're talking about.
Yeah, Jeff.
So is the problem the underlying structure that you just described, or is the problem the ideas that are attached to that underlying structure? So if I want to change the world, to use your idea, because there are thoughts that people have that I consider to be dangerous to myself and to our survival as a species, do I go after the idea, or do I go after the underlying cognitive structure or societal structure that enables an idea to exist without without a deliberation or without examination.
That's what we're going to talk about in class 4. That's exactly
Guess
what.
I'll come back.
No.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, particularly the role of we're going to look at ideas versus facts, and we're going to look at the problem with what happens when ideas, take on a life of their own and they get divorced from a factual understanding of the world. When ideas become ideologies, they can do a lot of damage, whether they're religious ideologies, whether they're political ideologies, or whether they're ideologies about something that's going on in the world. People get really, really ramped up, to change the world. That can become very dangerous. So that's a really good question, but I'm going to beg you, to your patience a little bit. But I think it's both. There's a structural element there, some of which we'll talk about next week. But I think there is this problem, with ideas versus facts that we're going to try and open up a little bit.
And beliefs. And the thing is, too, this is kind of sideways to your question, but what I found is when we first started doing the work, especially Rob would bring up really controversial topics. Really controversial topics without any, we started doing like a 3-minute thing about triggering and stuff. But that's when we saw we need to do this part first. Yeah. So in our year-long course, like Rob mentioned, the first 3 months is just doing triggers, defenses, needing to be right, cognitive biases, belief versus fact, and leaving room for both of those. Then the second third, we talk about civics, because we realize that people don't all understand how America works the same way. So we talk about free speech, which is very misunderstood right now. And then the last third, we talk about the issues themselves. So I don't know how that works in like a practical conversation, but I've noticed that it's not very useful of me if I'm trying to talk about an issue in which the other person feels really strongly, because I know that this survival triggering stuff is at work. And the more threatened people feel, what do they usually do? They grab on tighter, So sometimes the best thing to do is just be curious and not even put forth my own ideas, and just get them relaxed and trusting me, kind of thing.
Well, it kind of ties into Buddhism, becoming aware. I mean, for me, I remember when I started doing Buddhist meditation, it really helped me to understand that there was a difference between me and my thoughts, right? Mm-hmm. And it's the same kind of thing with ideas. That often there's a big difference between ideas and reality, and you have to kind of put those in check, a little bit. Being mindful of how our minds work, being mindful of all the things that are driving us, is a great starting point to be able to, look at what's going on in terms of the damage that we can do as human beings when we get together and we have all these great ideas and what have you. It's not to say that we shouldn't do that we shouldn't try and change the world and make the world better, but
we might be able to be doing it more effectively. Go ahead, David.
So we've talked about triggers tonight. Something I've wondered about, and many people that I've talked to have wondered, how can one man affect half of the nation in such a negative way, trigger them in a negative way, and affect the other half of the nation in such a positive way?
Well, it's called splitting. This idea of splitting that's just been made obvious, and we could go. That could be a whole day long. But I like the question is like one of those Zen koans.
This is off the record, but if you really want to know, and you're an intellectual, you're like me, you really like to engage intellectually. There's a great book that I just picked up by Victor Davis Hanson, who is also at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, called The Case for Trump. And he's a brilliant military historian who writes a lot. He's a conservative, but he writes it's a fabulous book in helping people understand why it is half of America voted for Donald Trump. And there are very, very good reasons why they did. And if you're someone like me, I was not a supporter of Donald Trump, it's really helpful to be able to engage intellectually so that you can kind of get into the mindset so that you can sit down and have a conversation with somebody and find some common ground.
And not be so judgmental.
Yeah, and it's really hard. I mean, the 2016 election it has really done a lot of damage to our culture, both, everybody. And so, again, that's a big part of what Marla and I do, is trying to help people sort it out without kind of taking sides on it, and without kind of, whitewashing the problems, whitewashing the things that ought to make people upset.
Like on both sides.
Yeah, but I'd encourage, if you're really interested in, because I think it answers that question somewhat, if you're coming from the place of how in the world could all these nice people that I know that voted for Donald Trump vote for Donald Trump, and then conversely.
So one last question, and then we're at time. Go ahead, Ari.
So, like the last few minutes we've been talking a lot about wanting to make the world a better place, and one thing I wrote down from your portion was that the human mind is a device for survival and reproduction, and those two things don't necessarily seem like the same to me.
Right.
So, like, kind of like few questions, but I mean, like, when you say that part of the mind, are we just talking about limbic and down? And, because the cerebral part seems like it's designed to create a better world.
Yes.
And,
Right. Yep. Yep.
So when you define mind, did that not really include the cerebral part?
It does. I think the point we're trying to make is that we are basically feeling oriented. We are basically driven by these survival instincts. But the wonderful thing is that we do have this capacity, but it doesn't happen automatically. We have to learn to deliberate and think about the world and reflect on the world. And, most people don't really reflect and deliberate about the world.
Yeah. But if you do, that pushes humans toward like a better world. That
Yes.
doesn't necessarily help you reproduce individually. Like, I'm looking at this list. These are all, like, you could define all these as like just complex human forms of sexual posturing.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right.
So yeah, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and in the
that distinction.
yeah, and in the class 4 we'll talk about that, because we'll bring back. I put Steve Pinker's book Enlightenment Now on the one of the slides. And Pinker's point is, how do we capture what the Enlightenment captured with really getting science on board? How do we, the power of our reason? How do we capture that to do good? Being mindful of all these survival instincts that cause us to often do things that aren't so good. Things like racism also came out of the Enlightenment too. So how do you balance those things? But it really is being able to capture what we're able to do with our reasoning capabilities to move beyond biology. You've probably heard of what's called the naturalistic fallacy. It's the idea that just because something is biologically true doesn't mean it's necessarily morally good. Just because, we're wired to survive and that's primitive to us, doesn't mean that we can't use our minds to move beyond our biology. And I think that's a big part of it, is how do we get beyond the limits and the constraints of our biology to be able to be more reason-based, more deliberative.
But it's a process.
Yeah.
It's not like this, because this whole thing, like, I can just speak from my experience with pushing my own edge. At every stage I had to I took a month off at one point because this was jangling my nervous system too much, and now I'm much more cognizant, like I'm okay. Even if I was getting pushback or whatever, I'm okay. So we've got to end, but thank you so much, and hope to see you again, and we'll continue.
Next class. Next Thursday, being right, not knowing and feeling uncertain. And then I'm going to talk about motivated reasoning, my side bias, which I think is the most important insight from the social sciences in the last 10, 20 years in terms of understanding why we disagree about facts, why we have to be right and all that kind of stuff. So, thank you.
Thank you.